Throughout history, there were many different horrific execution methods used to condemn a prisoner to death. There was in England hanging, drawing and quartering, in which a victim was forced to undergo a terrifying ordeal before they finally lost their head and their body was then cut into 4 pieces. Traitors across England during the 16th century also lost their heads on Tower Hill in London, and they would then have their heads placed high above London Bridge to act as an intimidating message not to cross the King or the Queen. But as the centuries rolled on, there were many different technologies developed to execute people, and this included the guillotine, a slanted bladed device created in France to take someone's head off as efficiently as possible. But the French people did not like this, and they preferred more brutal methods such as the breaking wheel. However, one lesser known execution method used, which was harrowing, was the death flights, in which a prisoner would literally be thrown out of an aircraft or a helicopter to their death. But the execution method was completely barbaric. Join us today as we look at the death flights, and as always, to support the Fortress, please make sure to subscribe. The death flight was a method of execution in which a victim would be dropped from an aircraft or a helicopter into different terrain to their deaths. Some victims were dropped into oceans and rivers before they then drowned, and also some victims were even thrown out from huge heights into mountain ranges. The death flights were used in different lands across Europe and in different continents, but they were prominently used inside of Argentina. The Argentinian Dirty War broke out in 1974, and during this it's believed that around 22,000 to 30,000 people disappeared or died, many being captured by the government. Operation Condor was launched, and during this the military and security services, as well as paramilitary death squads, rounded up anyone suspected of political dissent or harbouring socialist views. But many of these people were killed in death flights, and this began when Admiral Luis Maria Mendia popularised the execution method in the nation. Prisoners were held and then were tortured before they would be drugged, and they were then placed on board an aircraft. After this, the prisoner would be stripped of their clothes before they were either dropped in the Atlantic Ocean or in the Rio de la Plata River. It's believed that between 1977 and 1978, inside of Argentina, there were roughly 200 death flights, which acted as executions. One man, a former naval officer, Adolfo Schelingo, even admitted to being involved in 2 flights. But during these, around 15 people were killed, as the flights would not just condemn one person, but they would also throw many other people out of the aircraft at once, and Schelingo later estimated that around 2,000 people were killed, as the flights took place every Wednesday for 2 years. But the victims were often tortured further by being forced to dance before they were told about their fate. Schelingo stated that they were played lively music and made to dance for joy, because they were going to be transferred to the south. After that, they were told they had to be vaccinated due to the transfer, and they were injected with pentothal. And shortly after, they became very drowsy, and from there we loaded them onto the trucks and headed off for the airfield. He also claimed that some of those who had partaken in this crime were still hiding today. One man, Julio Alberto Poch, was in 2010 sent from Spain to Argentina, and he was arrested for his involvement in the death flights, and he then denied his involvement, and he was found not guilty of his crimes. But also further arrests were made years later, and it was said that a military unit, named Army Air Battalion 601, had been established with the intention of carrying out the flights, and it was said that there were soldiers who refused to take part in the executions, and that they had seen alive people as well as corpses that were loaded onto the planes, but they noted that when the aircraft came back, they were empty, of those prisoners and the bodies, with these having been dumped out of the aircraft. Further trials took place, and Juan Carlos Francisco Bossi, who was known as El Doctor, was then accused of his involvement in the death flights, and the disappearance of over 30,000 people. He confessed to being responsible for the deaths of 6,000 people. At one trial, there were 29 defendants sentenced to life imprisonment for their crimes, and 19 others were given differing sentences of varying prison time. But this was also carried out in other nations. In Colombia, for example, dissenters were thrown from aircraft, and inside of Guatemala, during the Guatemalan genocide, death flights were also used. 30 men were suspected of being killed by the execution method there. In Chile, the former personal helicopter pilot of Pinochet stated that he had thrown prisoners from his helicopter into the ocean or into the peaks of the Andes on different occasions. The flights were also used to ensure that slaughtered rebels' bodies were disposed of, and the corpses were often placed inside of sacks that were weighted down, and these were then thrown from the aircraft into the ocean. It's believed that during the rule of Pinochet that at least 120 civilians were thrown from the aircraft. In South Africa, it was used as an execution method upon rebel fighters. The government established Delta 40, a branch of the South African Defence Force, and many guerrilla fighters were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean, and many bodies were also thrown into very deep water. In French Algeria, the death flights were also used during the Algerian War, as French paratroopers, during the Battle of Algiers, dumped victims from planes. Executioners placed concrete blocks at the feet of the victims, and these were then thrown into deep water. Still today there are many people who are affected by the death flights and the actions of those governments and members of the military who carried out this brutal and harrowing execution method. There are people who are still investigating what happened to their loved ones, their neighbours and friends, and their locations are still missing to this day. But in recent years, a harrowing reminder of the death flights arrived back in Argentina. This was a small aircraft, a Skyvan, which had been made in Britain, and this specific plane had been used to make political dissenters and opponents disappear. This specific aircraft was located in Florida before it was sent back to Buenos Aires, and for the victims' families of the Argentinian dictatorship, the aircraft was a brutal reminder of their suffering. Some people had been searching for this plane for some time, and there was a hope that the return of it would bring a form of closure for some of the victims and their families. But still today, many of the victims of the death flights are forgotten about, and their fates, locations and bodies remain unknown to this day. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.